Quit being a paycheck thief, old-timer." She jeered, dousing me with tea, smirking at my flustered state. Unfortunately, the lunch break is almost over at this time, and no one is approaching the break room. The woman who had been laughing at me clapped her hands and, satisfied, turned her back on me to return to her work. After I quit my job, I lived a modest life. But one day my son said he wanted to introduce his fiancée and brought a woman home. I couldn't calm down, happy at such news. But when I saw the face of my son's fiancée, I froze. She too froze and slowly began to tremble. While casting a cold glance at her, I said one thing. "Please come in. There's a lot we need to talk about." She remained frozen, but reluctantly entered the house at my son's urging. "My name is Julianne. I'm a 65-year-old part-time administrative worker. I've been with this company for a long time. Over the years of raising children and working, the company has changed in many ways. It started as a small company with just a few of us, including me, but gradually expanded, and now the company has grown, with more employees. And the number of female employees, which was very few, is now a large family. I take pride in these changes. However, as time passes, it means that the inside of the company changes too. As I've gotten older, I've gradually started to feel left behind. Then a new wind blew into the workplace. With the mid-career hiring, new employees were added. With the increase in new employees, I was assigned as a trainer. I waited for the day, meeting with my boss and discussing various things as it had been a while since I had been a trainer. The new employee, Susie, is 27 years old and had also worked as an administrative worker before, so we're expecting her to be a strong addition immediately. On the day the new employee started, I met her. The new employee who appeared was beautiful and well-dressed, just like the young people of today. "Nice to meet you, Susie Horler. I look forward to working with you from today." She greeted me energetically with the freshness unique to new employees. After greetings, we got straight to work. While showing her around the department and explaining various things, the new employee just nodded without taking any notes. Worried, I would occasionally look back and ask if she understood, to which she'd respond disinterestedly, "Yes, I understand." Well, I thought she would learn the facility layout as she worked, so after finishing the tour, I returned to my desk. When I finally began explaining the work content, the new employee took out her mobile phone and started to play a video. Asking what she was doing, she said, "I'm recording so I can look back on it later. Isn't listening to explanations bothersome?" and urged me to continue. Here in the company, where sensitive content is scattered about that shouldn't be taken outside, I was at a loss with Susie's nonchalant attitude. After immediately stopping her from filming and telling her to take notes, Susie made an unhappy face. I convinced her after some discussion, and that day I was unusually tired by the time work ended. From the next day, Susie was extravagant. Not quite late, but she would arrive right at the start time and began doing makeup at her desk. When she noticed my stunned look, she'd say, "Oh, I'm listening, so go ahead and talk." When I pointed it out, she looked dissatisfied, and it took a while to get her to understand. And for the past few days, I repeated the same explanations about various matters. This wasn't working out, and I felt apologetic to my boss for expecting more from the new employee. A few days later, when Susie had been with us for half a month, she didn't come to work at the start time. Wondering what was wrong, I became restless, and then the boss pointed out the new employee's absence. I briefly apologized and tried to call Susie but couldn't reach her. As I began to worry about what to do, Susie showed up as if nothing had happened and sat at her desk. No greeting, no apology, and just like before, she started to put on her makeup. I was shocked, but noticing my boss looking over quizzically, I hastily asked Susie what had happened. But all I got back was a lazy reply, and I became even more flustered. "Were you feeling ill? Don't hesitate to call in those situations." And as I listed all the precautions I could think of, Susie clicked her tongue unbelievably. "Annoying, isn't it? I just have to apologize, right?" Saying this with vigor, she stood up and went to the boss with a sweet voice apologizing. Then the boss, not seeming too upset, smiled and urged her to get back to work, while I sighed in disbelief. When Susie returned to her desk, I decided to make sure to talk to her to prevent this from happening again. "What's with you? So persistent. I already apologized, didn't I?" Susie glared at me and became sullen. As I was about to reprimand Susie, who showed no sign of reflection, my boss called out to me. Reluctantly leaving my seat and going to the boss, I was told to let it go as she seemed to be reflecting. Perhaps because I was in his blind spot from his seat, he hadn't seen Susie's behavior. Unable to argue, I reluctantly nodded and returned to my seat. Then, I found my desk cluttered with napkins, cotton swabs, and more, all clearly used by Susie, smeared with eyeliner and lipstick. I looked towards Susie, but she didn't look back at all. After throwing away the trash on my desk, I could hear snickering from the next seat. Looking again, the new employee was sticking out her tongue, laughing. And from that day, childish harassment began. It was really tough from there on. Every day's small harassment, minor mistakes at work, and the boss's demands on new employee training. Susie first ingratiated herself with the boss, claiming her mistakes were because I wasn't teaching her properly. Receiving this, the boss told me to instruct her more carefully or to be more lenient. Thanks to that, I was stressed daily and felt I was going to crack from the strain. Then, one day after such days continued, I was summoned by the boss. Wondering what it was about, I went to another room, where I found the boss with a red face. Cautiously inquiring about the situation, it turned out that the new employee had sent important documents meant for a client to a completely different company. Since the new employee was in charge of sending out documents, the boss had asked her about it, and she had claimed I had checked the destination. Of course I had no recollection of doing such a thing, and I wasn't even aware that Susie had done the sending. Lately, I've been juggling my own work while struggling with Susie's training, and even finishing the work she was supposed to do to keep up, leaving me exhausted every day. I clearly told the boss I had no memory of such a check, and was told that this was a lack of supervision on my part. And instead of Susie, I was the one sent to apologize to the company that had been inconvenienced. Returning from the apology rounds, Susie turned to me with a creepy smile. "You were so strict, yet you couldn't do it yourself. That's no good for a trainer, taking your eyes off." Fury rising at her twisted, smiling face, I involuntarily slammed the desk and stood up. Then I was scolded by the boss for taking it out on others, and I sat down dejected. Then I was met with cold stares from other employees who didn't know the situation, and I felt isolated. Since then, Susie repeated small mistakes and blamed them all on me. Others noticed but didn't point it out, and Susie mocked me. Unable to tolerate such arrogant behavior, I called Susie out to a deserted place at the end of one lunch break. In the break room, as the lunch break ended, only Susie and I were there. And the new employee, as if she couldn't see me at all, was waiting for the water to boil. "Susie, your recent attitude has been terrible. Act properly if you're a working adult." Since no one was around, I decided to unleash everything I had been holding back. Since the document incident, the new employee's behavior got worse, with unauthorized tardiness as a norm. Going home without doing anything for a whole day was becoming frequent. The boss who allowed this is one thing, but taking advantage of it is another. If you don't like being noticed by me, then I think you should change your behavior so that it doesn't happen. What do you think you should do now?" When Susie heard the kettle make a noise, she turned off the stove and poured the hot water into her own bottle to make tea. "I mean, I do my job properly. After all, I manage to leave on time every day. Doesn't that mean I'm doing well?" "That's because I'm the one finishing the work you left behind." "But as my trainer, shouldn't it be easy for you to finish my leftover work? Or what? Are you setting me up to have to work overtime because of me? That's awful." Her words sparked my anger. Despite my efforts to reduce her daily workload so Susie could finish on her own. What an awful thing to say. What do you think you come here for every day? If you're not late, you sit down at your desk and start doing your makeup. Then after that, you chat with other employees, eat lunch, chat some more, handle a little bit of this and that, and then chat again. And after all that, you leave on time. Isn't that strange? That's harsh to call it chatting. I'm talking about work. And Julianne, you don't teach me anything, yet you pretend to work, right? Not teaching you anything? Despite my headaches, I've been patiently teaching Susie, even though she can't do as told. And still, she claims I haven't taught her anything. What does that mean? I couldn't stay silent and had to retort. Enough is enough. Stop using me as an excuse for not being able to do your job. As I was about to grab her, something was thrown in my face. It was the tea Susie had just made. The suddenness of it left me shocked, and I didn't feel the heat at first. But then the pain started to prick my face, and I felt the heat. I let out a silent scream, searching for something to wipe my face with. All the while, I could hear Susie's laughter. You can't even do your job, you salary thief old-timer. Quit today. Susie, having thrown the tea at me, looked at my panicked state and said with a sneer. Unfortunately, at this time when the lunch break is about to end and the afternoon work chime rings, no one is near the break room. Susie, who had been laughing at me satisfied, turned her back to return to work. As she left, I wiped my face with the thing thrown at me and regretted it. It was a rag normally used to wipe the wet floor. That day, with my face red from the heat, I insisted to my boss that I was ill and left early without listening to his attempts to stop me. The next day, I dropped a letter of resignation in the postbox, stating that I was retiring and would use up my remaining paid leave. About a month later, my son Greg said he wanted to introduce someone he was considering marrying. The burns on my face from the time had calmed down, leaving only a bit of a mark, so I was happy to welcome Greg and his partner. On the day Greg brought his intended, I had dressed up a bit and waited. While I was excitedly wondering who would come, the doorbell rang. The sound filled me with happiness, and I went to the entrance with a spring in my step and opened the door. Oh my, you're early. Please come in. Nice to meet you. I'm Susie Horler. I'm looking forward to today. As soon as I opened the door, I saw a familiar figure. I stopped speaking abruptly, but Susie energetically introduced herself. As our eyes met, her words gradually trailed off. With Susie frozen behind him, Greg confusedly urged her to come in. But Susie stood motionless, her face turned pale. Quickly regaining my composure, I put on a smile and invited them in. Welcome. You've done well to come. Please come in. We have a lot to talk about, I said as I went to the kitchen. Now I had to boil water and make hot tea. I could hear Greg calling to Susie several times in the entrance. And when they finally came out together, I told Greg and them from the kitchen to take it easy. Greg seemed to settle down on the living room sofa, but Susie sat next to him, head down, hands clenched. Of course she would be like this. Who would think that the person you decide to marry with a bright future ahead is the same trainer you used to harass? I waited for the water to boil and put it in the pot, placed the cups for everyone on a tray, and left the kitchen. As I placed the tray in front of Greg and Susie, who were sitting in the living room, Susie let out a small scream. Greg looked at Susie with concern. I poured tea into the cup and placed it firmly in front of Susie. Susie let out another small scream and shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Then, placing cups for Greg and myself, I said with a troubled laugh, "Sorry, I was so happy Greg was bringing his fiancée that I boiled the water too much. It's very hot, so be careful not to spill it." Seeing Greg indeed react to the heat of the cup, I pretended to panic and added, "See? I told you to be careful. It would be terrible if you were left with a mark like me." I watched Susie tighten her grip on her hands at my words. "Greg, Susie seems nervous. Why don't you start the conversation? How and where did you two meet?" As I drew out their story of how they began dating, I decided to gradually corner Susie. My, you've been together for half a year. Mom didn't notice at all." While listening to Greg's embarrassed story, I occasionally glanced at Susie. She didn't lift her face while Greg was talking, and when Greg turned to her, she would just nod or shake her head in silence. Then, pretending to be interested in the silent Susie, I finally addressed her. "Susie, was it? What are you doing for work now?" Greg looked worried when Susie didn't respond to my question. Still, Susie said nothing, so I pretended to help but goaded her. "You must be nervous because it's your first time meeting me. Or are you scared of me?" Watching Susie grip her hands even tighter at my words, Greg answered for her with a bit of annoyance. "Oh, an office worker, I see. I was one until just last month, but I've quit since then." While looking at Susie, I spoke as if to gently admonish her. Susie wouldn't look at me. Instead, she sat rigidly, not moving an inch. Greg, seeing her discomfort, tried to change the subject by talking about Susie's workplace. But of course I knew it. "Oh, you work there too? I was at the same place. What department are you in? Maybe we passed each other somewhere, like in the break room." At that, Susie shook and shrank even more. Greg started to worry about her as she acted stranger, but I kept talking without pause. "You see, I quit last month. Before I left, a new girl started, really free-spirited, you know. I was her trainer, and I tried to instruct her every day, but it was all in vain. Before things got out of hand, I tried to discipline her, and she ended up throwing tea in my face. That's when I couldn't take it anymore and quit. The kids these days, they're scary." Greg was indignant. I had told him I quit my job, but not why. Knowing now that his mother was injured, Greg offered to go to the police and even protested to the company. Hearing this, Susie looked up for the first time that day. The word police must have been too much for her to bear. But to beg for forgiveness now would let Greg know she was the one who caused the injury. So Susie just lifted her face without saying a word. Even now, she seemed unwilling to give up on marrying Greg, which left me beyond astonishment and almost impressed. But being impressed didn't mean I would allow Susie and Greg to marry. I said as if delivering the final blow. "I still remember the pain from that time. You do too, don't you, Susie?" I looked at Susie quietly. Susie wiped the cold sweat from her brow as her gaze wandered. Greg, unable to grasp the situation, looked back and forth between me and Susie, his frown deepening. "Since that incident, you haven't been able to do a single thing at work, but suddenly you can work after I quit? Greg was just saying you're the best worker among the female employees. But have you stopped making mistakes with the mailing list?" Susie's face turned pale as she began to tremble. Greg seemed to have decided to just watch the interaction between me and Susie, staying silent without interjecting. "Do you really intend to marry our Greg after doing such a thing? Do you think I would allow that?" As I pressed her, Susie stood up with force, and, glaring at me, began to speak decisively. "I never thought you would be Greg's mom. With a common last name like Smith, how could I have known? And what's with you, pestering me with sarcasm? Are you threatening me? If that's how it is, I can fight back too, you know. I'll sue you for harassment." I looked at Susie, breathing heavily from her tirade, with a cold gaze, and stood up, cup in hand. Seeing the cup, Susie seemed to realize what might happen next, and her face tensed. As I raised my arm with the cup, Susie instinctively covered her face with her arms. I then tilted the still hot cup and drank down the tea. Hot tea isn't a problem for me to drink. I prefer my tea hot. Susie, bracing for an impact that never came, slowly lowered her arms and looked at me cautiously. "Don't compare yourself with me. I don't have a hobby of hurting people just because I don't like them." Saying this, I went to the kitchen to put away the cup. To the stunned Susie, who remained motionless, I said one last thing. "You who are not worthy of our Greg, get out." With that, Susie left as if running away. Left behind, Greg watched me doing the dishes. After I explained everything in detail, Greg naturally broke off the engagement with Susie. He reported everything to Susie's parents, who deeply apologized without ever seeing me, and in lieu of going to the police, he declared that they would pay for compensation, past and future medical expenses. Because of this, Susie was disowned by her biological parents and kicked out of the house. Naturally, this was reported to the company, and knowing about me, the company president came to my place to leave compensation. The company hinted they didn't want this incident spread, but I didn't want to spread the story of my scar either, so I nodded in agreement. Greg still seemed unsatisfied, but I was happy that he got angry for me, so I soothed him, telling him not to worry about it anymore. Sometime later, Greg brought a woman home. This time, he said she was the one he would spend his life with. The woman he introduced was gentle and very kind. After talking with her for a while, I took a liking to her and felt relieved that Greg had finally found happiness. From now on, it would be happy days for Greg and all of us.